to wrap it up promptly at 11:45 because I need to be able to get into the sanctuary and get this set up and then also get dressed. So.
You look like you have clothes on.
Thanks, Marie.
You know, we're perfectly happy if you don't have time to throw a shawl over your.
Perfect. I might be tempted to do that.
Can't leave a sweater on, so.
It was chilly at my place.
Who wrote John? And
Okay.
is it the 5 or 7?
All right, we're getting started. We are continuing with the Gospel of John, and we are going to be looking at John this week and the next, and then we're done with John and with Adult Ed through August. We pick back up again. You're never done with John. You are never done with John. So last week we were talking context.
I'm actually leaving this afternoon, so.
Context and authorship, and just a quick recap of that for those that were here or for those that weren't. John is characterized specifically by the signs that appear in John, right? So at the beginning of John and at the end of John, there is similar phrases which says, there are many signs that Jesus performed. These signs are here so that you may come to believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. And then through the beginning of the Gospel of John, we get 7 signs, essentially, that are done. The first being the wedding at Cana, the last being the raising of Lazarus. And in between, we've got healings and Jesus walking on water and all that kind of stuff. And last week, we talked about the significance of that John is using this structure as a bit of an echo of the structure of Genesis 1. So 7 days of creation, 7 signs that Jesus is showing. Towards the end of last week, in fact, maybe 5 minutes before we quit, I mentioned that the further significance of it is that, there are 7 signs in the beginning of John, but the end of John, the resurrection narrative, is seen as the 8th sign, which is the signifier that in Jesus' resurrection, God is doing a new thing. It's a new day of creation, right? We cycle back to the beginning again. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And today what we're going to do, if you didn't get a Bible yet, make sure you grab one. We're going to look at John 1, which is the preface. John can essentially be broken into 2 parts. Last week I talked about how, we have this general structure kind of signifying that the author of John is using maybe Greek rhetorical devices. So you've got an intro, a preface, you've got the body of John, and then you've got the conclusion, chapter 21. But we can actually also break the body of John into 2 parts. The first part, which is up through the raising of Lazarus, is often referred to as the book of signs. And then the second part is essentially the book of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Today we're going to look at John 1, because this is essentially, for those of you who have done technical writing before, the preface is always the place in which the author tells you what they're going to tell you, right? This is where they introduce the main concept that we're working with. So we're going to look at John 1, and I'll read 1 through 1 through 18, and then I'm going to kind of reference and paraphrase the rest of chapter 1. So we're on John 1:1. And what I encourage you to do as we're listening to this is look for parallels perhaps between John 1 and Genesis 1, and also listen for what you might be hearing John's introduction to be, right? So this is as I mentioned, him introducing what he's going to tell you. Based on these verses, do you kind of have an inkling of what he's going to tell you? All right. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." What jumped out at you? What did you hear? Anything familiar in this? In the beginning, yeah. A paraphrase, a callback to Genesis 1. The verse that always catches my ears, just because I end up singing it so often, is verse 5. Hold an evening prayer. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
And then in Genesis it says, "Let there be light."
Let there be light. What are the themes that came up in here? You already put your finger on one, Linda. This theme of light that seems to be present.
Well, the Word.
Yes. The Word, yes, that is definitely a theme. This is a bit of a Sunday school question, but who is the Word referring to? Jesus. What does it mean to think of Jesus as the Word? I mean, what is John saying when he uses that metaphor?
That God is speaking through Jesus.
Sure. Yeah, that's certainly God. Again, there are no right answers here. We're working our brains, and I realize you may not have had enough coffee yet. Oh, the answer. Linda said that God is speaking through Jesus. That might be why John refers to him as the Word.
Does he also say the Word came in flesh?
Yes, the Word incarnate. Right? Here's a theological concept. Again, so much of our theological language comes out of the Gospel of John. In fact, the Word made flesh, the Word manifest.
Isn't the word logos?
Yes.
Wisdom.
It is logos. Yes, and that's a really good and interesting parallel as well. Is that Jesus is often considered the manifestation of wisdom, and in fact, well, this would be a long tangent. There's a really good book out there called "She Who Is" by a woman named Elizabeth Johnson, who makes the argument essentially that this is a way in which we can basically understand the feminine in Jesus in the second person of the Trinity, because wisdom in the Greek concept is Sophia, is a feminine personal feminine manifestation, personalization. That's not the word I'm looking for. I don't know. Anyways, but yeah, and so John referring to Jesus as Word, you could also say is a bit of a synonym for wisdom as well too. What does it mean for a word to manifest? One of the things that we often miss, well, one of the things that we have a hard time identifying with is that because we are a literate society, we who are trained to read and write from a young age, it's hard for us to empathize with a pre-literate society. Not that this is a pre-literate society, but again, one of the things to remember is that many of Jesus' disciples probably were illiterate, right? And so we tend to take for granted the ability to put a word down on paper, to have a concept last longer than the person who had the idea, right? The pure gift of being able to share information forward, right? Share information and ideas and concepts between peoples and between generations is profound, right? And you can make the argument that the ability to record the written word is the spark that jumpstarts the advancement of technology in society, right? So if you look back historically, if you look back to the kind of slow acceleration of human progress, during the age of pre-literate society, you've got pretty much everyone's on equal footing, right? But what happens is that as societies and communities become able to share with each other ideas, but then also pass those ideas down to generations, right? Not only through oral tradition, right? Because in a pre-literate society, oral tradition is extremely important, but to actually have, copies of ideas able to distribute. These are the things that mark the advancement of society, right? So what does it mean when we read John saying Jesus is the Word, right? And he doesn't actually say those things. He says, in the beginning was the Word. We're already interpreting these things through our theological lens. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. Again, I'm not looking for a right answer here. I'm just asking us to flex our brains a little bit, right? Beth, what do you hear?
It's part of the whole mystery of the Trinity. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So Jesus is God as well as being the incarnate God. So he was in the beginning, meaning it's not a different God. It's part of the original God.
Yeah. And what we are also getting here is we're getting a window into a historical argument. Right? So one of the main debates that exists in the early forms of Christianity are upon the nature of Jesus. Okay? In fact, this is basically the knockdown, drag-out fight that causes the most conflict in the early church, kind of post-persecution era, right? This is where we get our creeds from, by the way. The idea that Jesus is not just a prophet, not just a person who comes after, but when John says, in the beginning was the Word, what John is arguing is that Jesus, the three persons of the Trinity, coexist and did not create each other, right? That they all pre-exist, well, they all exist at the same time, right? Which is important, and this is why the Athanasian Creed exists. Does anybody remember the Athanasian Creed, that whole page?
No.
Jim, you're going to say something. I'll pull it.
More of a question. What's the origin of the word, or how it was written? Is it the word that if I hear the word now, I have a certain image. Was it when it was first written? What's the?
You mean logos?
No.
Oh, just the concept of.
I can't remember if it was written in Greek or written in Latin or written.
In here. This is, Greek. Absolutely. John's writing in Greek. It's logos.
In Greek. I'm sorry, it's logos. Okay.
Yeah, yep.
I missed that part.
Yeah. It is absolutely logos. Yeah.
Well, Jesse,
No.
then just suddenly it pops into my brain here that, we came out, mankind, civilization came out of relatively dark ages where precious few people were literate. And the Hellenization of the ancient world really ushered in that whole new era where people had much more access to education, and that set off a flurry of creative writing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just the ability to distribute information is again, we take for granted, living in the era of the internet, when I can go on here and pull up whatever I want. I mean, I forget sometimes how entitled I am being born in a pre-internet era, right? I grew up in the 80s and 90s when back when you had to have encyclopedias. Back when your teachers did not allow you to use Wikipedia as a reference. Right, exactly. Wikipedia. When did that? Back when you had door-to-door encyclopedia salespeople, right? When the Encyclopedia Britannica was the answer for all things. Yeah.
Well, in college, we spent hours and hours and hours in the library.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of libraries, you have the Library of ELCA, which was the first huge
collection
of the knowledge that was existing at the time.
Absolutely.
And then predating that, I mean, the thing that got me about the Jewish Bible, even though it was hand-scribed,
yeah,
I mean, they were meticulous,
yep,
critical about errors.
Yep.
And so the point was that they did not allow errors.
Yeah.
If error was found, the whole page was destroyed.
Yep.
And an error could be a comma, or literally that one. They did not allow that. So the presence of integrity of the word was highly prized.
Yeah. And and the other piece that we space on is, so early forms of the Torah are all scrolls. Okay, so the first 5 books of the Bible are on one continuous sheet of paper. I mean, they're patched together, right? It's not necessarily one 100-mile long piece of papyrus.
To get through confirmation, she had to memorize it all too.
Yeah.
And memorize the meetings.
Yes, I did too. Yeah, I was probably one of the last classes that had to memorize, the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, the 10 Commandments, and then when I went through seminary, I had to memorize. I forgot it all now. Luther's explanation. I basically had to memorize a small catechism. I had to, be able to from rote repeat the Luther's explanation of the creeds and the commandments and all that stuff. But yeah, I haven't been to school in a long time, but I wonder what that is like in today's education era. Even when I was doing my chemical engineering degree, there was a big shift that was happening, where the teachers were teaching you to reference the chemical engineer's handbook, not necessarily to memorize concepts anymore, right? That was, basically one entire class was just learning to navigate the AICHE handbook, right? Which is this thick and it costs like $400 or something like that. And I'm ticked because I lost my copy at some point. I have no idea where it ended up. But yeah, I mean, that's a shift in how we understand things as well too. In fact, one of the earliest shifts that happens is moving from symbols representing things, right? So hieroglyphics is a process by which a symbol represents an idea to a symbol representing a sound instead, right? An alphabetic language, an aleph-bet language, meaning that the letter represents a sound, and when you have these small building blocks, it is much, much, much easier to memorize what words are, right? Because when you have a hieroglyphic language, you have to know each symbol. You have to memorize however many thousand symbols there are that represent however many concepts, but your language is also limited by, your concepts are also limited by your language, because if you want to create a new idea, you have to create a new symbol. And how do you tell people what that symbol represents without being able to basically talk with them? But when you have letters that represent sounds, which you can make words from, suddenly your opportunity for iteration is endless, right? Any idea that you want to express, you can create out of these base units, right? So
Kind of like writing music.
Absolutely. Music, mathematics, these are all languages that we speak, right? So what's fun to think about with this is when John says word, right? What that means to the people that are hearing it, right? Again, there's no right answer here, but we're trying to put ourselves in the mindset. After all, this is the context of the Gospels. We're trying to put ourselves in the mindset of the people that John is writing to. So when John says, "In the beginning was the Word," Jesus is the Logos. What did they hear? What did that mean to them? One thing we haven't talked about yet, but we are talking about, is when Jesus says, "In the beginning was the Word," of course, everybody's brains, just like yours and mine, go straight to Genesis 1, For these people, for whom, the Bible was the Torah, right? They absolutely knew what John was saying. And they would have associated with it that God speaks creation into being. Right? So John, in this first paragraph, is essentially making the argument that Jesus is complicit in the process of creation. Right? Through the Word, all things came to be. Right? So what John seems to be saying about God is Jesus contains within himself the essence of creation. If God speaks creation into being, it is through Jesus that things are created. Now, again, fast forward, get through the book of signs to the end of the Gospel of John. Jesus is resurrected. He is the new thing, which also means that if Jesus is the Word, you can also make the argument that Jesus is the new idea. Jesus is the new thing that's coming forth. And again, you can't belabor this. What John is doing in his gospel is presenting Christianity as a new thing, right? Which again, this is the contrast between John and synoptics. The synoptics are presenting the story, presenting different perspectives on the story, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all giving you different pictures of it. John assumes you know the story, right? Go back, we'll read a couple of verses here. And the Word, I'm in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Then he talks about John, right? John the Baptist. The author is assuming that you know who John the Baptist is.
Well, isn't verse 6 about John the Baptist also?
There was a man sent from God whose name was John. That's about John the Baptist. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. The law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. What's going on there? The law was from Moses, but grace and truth come from Jesus. Yes. And doing it theologically as well, too. And again, it's hard for us. Lutherans in the 21st century, we have gone through 2,000 years of rigorous theological processing, right? We just make this assumption that Jesus is about grace, Jesus is about forgiveness, Jesus is about love. But the people that are living in first century Jerusalem who are becoming Christians are just now putting these ideas together, right? They are taking the stories of Jesus that they may have experienced firsthand or they might be hearing, having read to them. And they're like, man, Jesus did this. He spent a lot of time with these people. He talked a lot about forgiveness. Is that different from the tradition that we grew up with, right? And how is forgiveness? How is the concept of forgiveness that they saw in Jesus different than the concept of forgiveness that they were maybe raised with growing up, as people of the temple, right?
Well, I would offer this, in the sense that I think because the Torah is basically a law, so it's a contract.
Yes.
And Jesus is not about a contract.
Yes.
Jesus is about a gift.
Yeah. And in fact, and that's, so this is it's not a debate, but when I say the words of institution, leading up to the Eucharist, I say, the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to his disciples, said, "This is my body given for you. Eat this, do this for the remembrance of me." After supper, he took a cup, he blessed it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "This cup is a new covenant shed in my blood for the forgiveness of sins. Drink this, all of you. Do this for the remembrance of me." How is a covenant different from a contract?
Are the roots like coming together?
Yeah.
Then coming.
Yes. Yes. And this, by the way, is the thing that gets harped on you in your 4 years of seminary, is as a Lutheran, do you understand the importance of the difference between covenant, testament, contract, right? Because as humans, we tend to kind of think of the same thing. Like if I said, "Carolyn, I'm going to make a covenant between me and you." We don't use this language so much anymore, but what I'm kind of hearing is I'm going to make an agreement between me and you. It involves a duality of process, right? It's twofold. One of the things that we as Lutherans really cling strongly to is that when we hear the word covenant, this is indicating a promise that God is making to us.
I was going to say a promise.
It's not a two-way thing. It's not a thing wherein we say, well, if you do this, God does this. And this is one of those really important differences because that was exactly how much Jewish thinking worked during the first century. And again, this is not about Jewish apologetics. I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to critique that theology, that philosophy. But John is creating a difference. And we as Christians have changed how we understand our relationship between the divine and human beings, right? We have done a new thing. And it is different from how most Judaism functions, right? So again, this is not about critiquing Judaism, but it's about helping us understand how we think differently. And this is the source of how we think differently, right? One of the early claims of the Christian church is that you are no longer held to the contract of the law, right? In fact, Paul repeats this. Jesus says it, right? What does Paul say? Over and over and over again. In fact, the whole 6th through 8th chapters of Romans is about Paul dismantling the relationship between the law and human beings. Now, one of the things that we always struggle with then is well, if we're not held to the contract of the law, right, does that mean that we can just do whatever we want? This is the typical kind of, Lutheran spin-off philosophical wormhole that we go down. But don't go that far yet. John's not there. John is trying to help a people understand that they're not held to that contract anymore, right? God has done a new thing in Jesus, and that new thing means a new way of relating to the divine, right? But that new thing also existed with the old thing, right? This is the other important thing that John is saying here.
Is that grace?
Absolutely, grace factors into this. I mean, grace upon grace, right? That's one of the that's verse 16. From his fullness we have received grace upon grace. And to be fair, when we talk about a lot of these things, we use a lot of religious terminology like grace and forgiveness and promises and covenants, and it all kind of meshes together to a certain extent. If you really want to get nitpicky, you can parse those words and their definitions, but we don't have to go there, because what John, I think, is trying to do right here is just to get people's brains to start working on the idea that God relates to human beings not through a process of exchange of commitment, but rather God commits to human beings out of love, out of the concept of love.
I always thought that the laws in Deuteronomy were written when Moses and the people went to the promised land, they were set up for them to be guiding for their lives.
Yes.
In other words, giving them some guidance of what to do.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, that's one of the ways that it functions. So, and to be fair, this is also one of the ways that we understand the law to function, right? So, absolutely, if you read through the Levitical Deuteronomical law, it is a bunch of practical guidance, right? A lot of it has to do with how the community governs itself. What do you do if one person hurts another person? What do you do if somebody steals their neighbor's cow? How do you navigate this world? They're not necessarily introducing new ideas there either. I mean, most modern biblical scholars will point that the Levitical law is based somewhat, at least, off the Code of Hammurabi, earlier pre-existing books of law. So human beings, over the course of time, have come to somewhat of an agreement as to the things that help society function, right? How you get along with your neighbors. Excuse me. One of the things that I always point to about the Levitical law that's really important is its focus and emphasis upon how you treat those that don't fit into your societal model. So in those days, it is widows, orphans, and foreigners are the three that don't fit into the model of society that they're functioning with. So, from that standpoint, this is, one of the things I always point to. It's a very progressive law in that regards, and I always lament when we when we lose our focus on that, right? When people point back to the Levitical gospel or to Levitical or Deuteronomical law and pick out specific things that they think should be applicable in today's era, and yet we don't leave a tenth of our field to be gleaned. We don't we don't have protections in place for those who find themselves on a fixed income late in life because their husband died and they don't have access to that pension anymore, right? We don't care for those who are forced to flee violence in their homeland, right? So if you're gonna pick out one, if you're gonna hold yourself to that contract with the law, by all means, make sure that you pay attention to the stuff that really gets harped on the most. But again, what John is saying here is that it's not that the law isn't still important, but most importantly, that's not how God relates to us, right? This is what John seems to be introducing here. And the contrast, of course, is that, and it's not necessarily in the Levitical law, but it's really in Proverbs and Psalms, in much of the wisdom literature, and it existed in the philosophy of the first century Jews. There was this idea essentially that if good things were happening to you, it meant that God loved you. Bad things were happening to you, it meant that God was displeased with you in some form. And so when you look at this model of the world, you kind of have to figure out, well, why, right? Why is God ticked at me? How do I assure myself and others that God is pleased with what I'm doing so that I may live a blessed life? Well, you hold the contract of the law. And if you read through the post-exilic literature, right? So if you read Chronicles and Kings, much of what's written there is an explanation for why bad things happen to Israel. And if you look at it, the reason that seems to be held up the most is the people failed to maintain the contract, right? They failed to live up to the law. There were evil kings that did not do what God required of them. So this concept exists in the people that John is speaking to. So again, I don't want to belabor this, but this is the first really instance where somebody is coming out and saying, we can't be Jews anymore because the way that we relate to God is different. The way that we understand God to function in the world is different. It's not about disdain for the Jewish people. It's not about people doing things wrong or thinking wrong. It's that we can no longer hold ourselves to those same expectations. We can no longer participate in that same way of relating to God because in Jesus, God is relating to us in a new way, right?
Greek and Roman gods.
Yeah.
They have the same sort of thing, right? Like if things were going badly, you
Yeah.
needed to please the gods.
It's more chaotic than that. So the thing that we struggle with in understanding like Greek pantheon, I love talking about this stuff, by the way, so this is going to be our last 10 minutes, I don't doubt. But this is the other thing that's important. Again, John is speaking to a dual society here. He's speaking to people that are coming who are Hebraic Jews. He's also talking to people who are Hellenistic Jews, and he's also talking to people that are coming from Gentile people who are coming from perhaps participating in the Greek pantheon. Greek gods are people. This is the most important thing to understand. Greek gods contain within them all of the same faults and failings that human beings do. They just happen to be a lot more powerful than human beings. So one of the things that we struggle with is we look at our relationship with the divine, and we see the divine as an example to emulate, right? We want to live Christ in the world around us. We want to be the image of Christ. Nobody wanted to emulate Zeus, okay? Zeus was a jerk, Zeus was a rapist. He killed children. He was just an awful, awful human being. Same goes for pretty much all of them. In fact, if you look at the entirety of the Greek pantheon, there aren't very many good examples, right? They each have their moments, right? Hades, god of the dead, but seemed to be an okay dude sometimes, except that he kidnaps Persephone. But that worked out okay in the end because Persephone had some kind of, what is it when the hostage comes to love Persephone is a great example of Stockholm syndrome, right? But then Hades tricks her, has her eat the pomegranate, And for every seed of the pomegranate that she eats, she's forced to spend spend a month top or bottom side with Hades, which is how we get the seasons, by the way, because 3 months out of the year, Persephone has to live with Hades, and Demeter, Persephone's mother, is so devastated every time that Persephone leaves that Demeter, the goddess of hearth and nature, then gets depressed and the world gets covered in snow. That's basically. I wrote a paper on this when I was in junior high.
What I like about Hades was he's the only god that didn't have an affair on his own.
This is absolutely true. And he basically got the very short end of the stick, right? Poseidon got the sea, Zeus got the sky, and Hades gets stuck in the underworld. He did not choose that place of abode. So this is one of the. So when you relate to the gods as a Hellenistic person who is participating in the Greek pantheon, you appease them, right? You do sacrifices. When sailors go out, they give offerings to Poseidon, not because they revere Poseidon and hope that Poseidon loves them, but because they're hoping that Poseidon won't randomly call up a storm and sink their boat. Saying, Poseidon, here you go, have this, whatever, this bottle of wine that I'm pouring into the sea. Please sink the other guy's boat, not mine. Right? That is so far removed theologically that this is why we don't get necessarily Paul or John or any of the other kind of late stage early Christians writing about the Greek pantheon, right? Is because it's so different that nobody is confusing, Christianity with that. Pretty much the only kind of reference that you get to it is Paul speaking at the Areopagus, right? Where Paul points to the statue of the unknown God, and he says, you who have all of these, you who basically pay obeisance to all of these other gods, you have this one statue to the unknown God here. Guess who it is? It's Jesus, right? That's the argument. I'm really cutting things short. But the reason that exists, this is also one of the fun idiosyncrasies of the Roman Empire, is because if you conquer lands and your soldiers come into this new land and you talk to these people and they're like, well, you guys have those gods, we've got these gods, right? One of the hardest things to do is to get people to change their religion, right? This is how you can be convinced that they're going to rebel against you if you come into their land and try to make them change how they believe, right? So how do you make sure that these newly conquered territories don't revolt? You say, oh, your gods are fine too. Yeah, we've got a bunch of gods, you've got a bunch of gods. Your gods can be friends with our gods, right? That's A-okay. In fact, we have a statue to the unknown God to remind us of how many gods there are out there that we haven't discovered yet, right? And so Paul points at that and says, now, let me tell you about a new truth, right? Let me tell you that unknown God, that God that you are constantly searching for is Jesus. Pretty good sermon, by and large, different audience. Yeah.
Going back to the word, and you said that the Greek word also means wisdom.
Logos, the Greek word, is the word. Sophia is wisdom. But there's an argument that is a pretty good argument that those two words are not necessarily synonyms, but they're very closely related.
Okay, so when you're talking about all these gods and everything,
yeah,
and who to listen to, and
yeah,
who to, I interpret if the word also relates to wisdom, maybe this is, okay, you can have those gods, but this is the one you need to listen to.
Yeah. And have no other gods before you. Yeah. Here's the thing that I don't know, because we don't really hear anything about it, is how people transitioning from worshiping the Roman pantheon, how they made that transition. One of the things that we do see is, because Paul writes to it, is that they struggle not necessarily to let go of their theological convictions, but they struggle to let go of the social conventions, right? There's a big debate that occurs over whether it's okay to eat food that has been sacrificed to other gods, right? Because, right, you're a Roman living in Roman society, all your friends are going to the block party, right, where they're making a sacrifice to Zeus, which is just an excuse to have a big picnic, right? Why can't is it okay for me to eat that food, right? And who's making that complaint? Well, it's the Hebraic Jews who are sitting there going, number one, that's not kosher. I guarantee that food has not been prepared in a kosher manner. Number two, this is why we got exiled, is by worshiping other gods. You can't do that. And Paul's sitting there going, yeah, but this is just a social thing, right? Because they can still go out and hang out with their friends that aren't Christians. Is that okay too? And so Paul has to navigate that world. Yeah, but we don't really get a picture of what it looks like for them to transition theologically or philosophically into this. I think one of the reasons that Gentile country is such fertile ground for Christianity is because of the nature of the relationship between human beings and the concept of God that exists in the Greek pantheon, right? Again, these are not people that you look up to necessarily. I mean, you look up to Zeus, right? But it's out of fear, out of a sense of appeasement, right? These are essentially super powerful human beings, or super powerful beings, right? Who, through whimsy and wit, do things to affect the world, right? Like, why are there seasons? Well, because one god ticked off another god. That's why there's seasons, right? Nowhere in that is human agency involved, right? You are a victim of the gods. You don't participate in it. Here comes this other idea that Paul is so happily spreading, right? That not only do you have agency in the relationship with God, but this God actually loves you. This God actually cares about you, right? This God actually wants you around and sees value in you. You aren't just some little ant, eking out an existence in the world that Zeus might accidentally squash, So it never shocks me that the Greek, that the Hellenistic society proves to be fertile soil for Christianity. Considering the alternative, much, much better. But that's also why so much of the conflict that we see ends up being about leaving behind Judaism, right? And that's why I'm kind of belaboring all of this. That, who John is writing to are people that are struggling to conceptualize that they are no longer bound to that identity. Because really, that's the hard part of this, too. That's the hard part, is that when you are raised seeing yourself as a Jew or a Lutheran or a Presbyterian, right, you can change the way that you think. Maybe, arguably, you can even change the way that you believe through experience, through learning different things. But you don't really change who you are. And part of who you are was formed and founded by the faith of your youth, right? Who in here, well, you don't, but do we have folks in here that transitioned between Christian traditions, right? People that maybe came from a Catholic background, or even a Presbyterian or Methodist, or completely different, right? And if you look at who you are, can you deny that there are pieces of you that are still Catholic, right? I wish Shirley Meyer was here, because she's always really good at talking about her Catholic roots. Are there pieces of you that are still Presbyterian or Anabaptist or whatever? Absolutely. Do you think differently, believe differently? Yes, arguably, yes. But do you still struggle with that person? Absolutely. John is smack dab in the middle of this process, right? So John is making the statement, we are all becoming a new thing in following Jesus. But it's a process of grief. It's a process of letting go an identity that was hugely important to these folks. And I think this is the thing that we need to pay attention to in reading the Gospel of John. This is why John introduces new imagery, new signs, new ideas, new theologies, new concepts for who God is and who Jesus is, because he has to, right? You can't keep reusing the old ideas if you're becoming something new, right? But that pendulum swings too far the other direction at times as well. Right?
You gotta go.
Yeah, I know it's 1:45. I gotta sit. Okay. Thank you, everybody. So next week we are going to look at the resurrection narrative. That's where we're primarily going to focus on. We've talked about the book of signs. I was thinking to read a couple more passages today, but this is what happens. But next week we're going to look at the post-resurrection stuff that exists in John. Thank you.